So welcome back to Everything Marketplaces, where we talk with marketplace founders and leaders from some of today's top marketplaces. So this is episode 40, and I am super excited to welcome on Mike Duboe, who is currently a general partner at Greylock. So if you're not familiar with Greylock, it is a legendary fund that has invested in some top marketplaces such as Airbnb. So prior to Greylock, Mike was the head of growth at Stitch Fix and then also a growth advisor to some YC startups. So Mike is definitely a top mind when it comes to marketplaces and growth, and I'm super excited to have him join us here today and dive into things. So Mike, welcome to the group chat. And wow, what a treat it is to have you join us here today. I would say most in the group know you, but for those that don't, if you can maybe start off by sharing a little bit more on your background and what led you into marketplaces, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, thanks for having me. It's I've been a fan of the Slack group, and it'll be fun to chat. I'm currently one of the partners at Greylock. So we're a fairly long-standing venture firm. We're on our 16th fund right now, investing out of $1 billion fund. The team is about 10 or so active general partners. So I'm one of them. I focus mostly on marketplaces, both B2B and consumer, as well as e-commerce infrastructure. And there's some overlap between those two as well. I also cover kind of consumer more broadly. But I think as far as how I got to focusing on marketplaces, I mean, Greylock historically has been a firm who, like many VCs, are somewhat obsessed over network effects. And for us, I mean, it stems from, we were early investors in LinkedIn, then went to go hire Reid. And so Reid Hoffman's at the firm. And so probably no better person, at least no better person in the world who I've spent time with talking about marketplaces and networks than Reid. So yeah, that's, and I'm happy to go in a little bit more detail on Greylock, but I guess like how I got into it. So my career before then was really running growth at early and growth stage companies. You mentioned two of them. So Stitch Fix is where I was most recently before Greylock. Not really a marketplace. You could kind of stretch and say, there's like a labor marketplace element to the stylists, but reality is like I wouldn't call it a marketplace. I would call it really a new personalization engine and potentially like a distribution channel for brands. But at running growth there was very much on like the performance marketing side. We went from spending not a whole lot, if anything, before I joined, and then I stayed until about a year post IPO, and we were spending, I don't know, around 100 million or so on marketing. And so that's like one aspect of growth. I think the more interesting side is actually closer to what I was doing before, which was more kind of on the product and referral mechanisms. I was working at a social payments company called Tilt. We were also kind of doing crowdfunding stuff in the earlier days, and that business, while Stitch Fix did have a good outcome, Tilt did not end up the way we wanted it to. It was kind of a soft landing to Airbnb, but probably learned a lot more there. We spent a good amount of time just thinking about how the different like referral loops and growth loops that we had in the product. So and I could go a little bit deeper into that if it's relevant. It might not be relevant to here, but I think like the focus on marketplaces is really when I think about the most interesting growth challenges and the most kind of like multifaceted and honestly just like impactful growth problems that I could be working on. Typically, they are in marketplace related businesses or networks, and so it's not a coincidence that I joined Greylock, because we used to run these groups of we had a VP growth community, a VP Eng product, et cetera. So I was in our growth community. We would talk about this stuff for a while. So I knew the firm for a few years before I joined. And yeah, there's actually probably the most relevant examples. I was very close to joining a B2B marketplace startup that's doing very well now if I didn't join Greylock. And so that kind of opened up my eyes to I think this model that we all know very well on the consumer side, and kind of how it was starting to creep into B2B verticals. And that's, a thesis I've been investing behind for the last couple of years. So I'll pause there. Sorry, that was a long intro.
Oh no, that was great. So thanks for sharing more with us. So I definitely want to take a step back a little bit and to the early days at Tilt, and maybe if you could share a little bit more about Tilt for those that might not be as familiar with it, and then your initial kind of the growth mindset there and your approach to growth.
Yeah, so it's funny. I don't get asked a ton about this one, but it was we had our moment. So I joined this company just a few months or weeks after we raised our Series A. So we were kind of a hot YC company in 2012, and the company was interesting. Like the this notion of crowdfunding at the time was just likened to things that were growing on Kickstarter, and then GoFundMe was kind of just getting going at the time too. So you would have like new products kind of raising funding before they would launch for like pre-orders and such, and then causes like medical fundraisers and that type of thing. But James, the CEO, who now runs a podcast and stuff, and is a investor, good content creator. He the insight was that that's a very limited view of what crowdfunding can be. And actually, if you envision what crowdfunding looks like in a mobile world, it actually wound up being much more for these kind of like smaller, more regular, more habitual, either causes or events or campaigns. And so it could be a group of college students raising money for like a spontaneous party they want to throw, or it could be you're walking around a community, you notice a pothole on your street and you want your neighbors to chip in for it, right? So so we were seeing all sorts of stuff happen on the platform at the time, and it was growing like 20% plus like month on month, but really without a clear synthesis or like reason why. And so I was kind of joined to help demystify that and figure out where we had our strongest product market fit and double down on that. So most of the company at that time, with maybe one or two exceptions, were engineers like writing code. So we ended up finding we basically, the first couple months there, I'll go into a little bit of detail here, but I won't take us too far on this tangent. But I think there's maybe some lessons from it. Like what I did the first couple months was just rank ordered all of our organizers by frequency of use, by how many times they've used it, and then just called them. And so I went through like 100, 150 calls, and like it turned out we weren't labeling things. Like, remember, this was 2013. Data infrastructure was a little bit lacking, and so some of this stuff is maybe a lot easier to do now. But at the time, actually getting on the phone was really colorful, just to understand like who these people were, how they're using the product, et cetera. And it turned out that most of them were actually like college students who were otherwise like organizing either Greek system stuff or clubs, or basically instances where they otherwise would have been collecting cash and checks, and usually for these like larger group events, so like kind of 20 plus person campaigns where Venmo and PayPal were like becoming things at the time, but it was not convenient when you needed to go and collect from like 20 or 30 people. So that actually looked a little bit different than like this crowdfunding vision that James had pitched. And we took the company down this direction pretty hard to really focus on colleges and map out our growth on like a community by community basis. And so we got quite quantitative to understanding what is the threshold at which like a campus is penetrated, after which like call it 10%, the rest growth is basically a given from there. And we built this kind of community team to really do manual stuff and focus on getting them to that, call it 10% point. And then after there, we would kind of like take our hands and go to the next school. And at that time, like Uber and some of these other companies were building like their market launch teams. And so, we hired some people out of there, and it looked actually quite similar. There's some lessons now in hindsight why that, it worked, but it might've been a costly strategy. And I think the big lesson from that company was not like growth was actually, it was growing quite fast, but we never found a way to make it a great business. Remember, like Venmo was backed by PayPal, and so could afford to burn a good amount and be an investment for them. We had a bunch of VC backing, but it's not the same thing. So that's the story there. Oh, the last point I wanted to make on just growth there. So the lesson is probably around the importance of having like a growth model from the onset. And so we developed something called a user state model where the way the product works is if you're an organizer, you need to actually recruit a certain amount of contributors to the campaign to be successful, right? To successfully use the product, because the whole dynamic is no one is charged until it tilts, until a number of people like end up chipping in. So so some of those users are going to be new to the network and some are going to be existing, and it's on the organizer to go and acquire them, which is really, we didn't have to spend a lot in paid acquisition at that company. It's close to nothing. So so that made for a really powerful dynamic, but we also we worked really hard to quantify the trade-offs between hey, should I focus my product team on actually driving organizer repeat or contributor organizer retention, or actually driving net new contributors and surfacing new campaigns to them? Like, these were very quantitative trade-offs that we that we had to make. And I think it was very illuminating when we hired like 2 analysts very early on. They were like ex-LinkedIn BizOps, who were probably the most high leverage kind of people in that company, I would say. So so anyway, there's some stuff we can go and do there if it's relevant, maybe later, but I'll pause.
Yeah. No, definitely that's probably a little bit of a a throwback on that one, but we had quite a few in the group that were asking about Tilt earlier, so I want to jump into it a little bit. We'll probably get into it in the group questions here some. But yeah, so after Tilt, what led to the transition and joining Stitch Fix?
Yeah, so Stitch Fix, I guess the personal aspect to that story. So I had known the COO there is this phenomenal entrepreneur, Julie Bornstein, who was actually on the board, and her husband, I worked closely with at Tilt. He was our COO. And so I was reflecting on, I left Tilt probably, I don't know, 6 months before the acquisition at Airbnb, but it was kind of, I'd spent 3.5, 4 years of my life on something that was, it was the greatest team, and I don't regret a minute of it. And like I said, those lessons were invaluable, and the team, a lot of people there still I call like very close friends. It was a very special culture that we had. But I thought it would be interesting to actually like swing the pendulum to the other side, where Tilt was kind of this like high growth, high burn situation. Stitch Fix was in an interesting position at the time, and I wouldn't have known this had I not, known some people there, that, the business had, Katrina famously did not raise a bunch of venture money early. She actually had a hard time doing so. And so at a certain point, she's like, screw this, we're going to control our destiny and just be profitable. And so this was the business that the time I joined was like not growing as fast as they could, but that was a deliberate choice. And they had made the commitment to actually wanting to dial that up, but it was on this foundation of like profitability, which was like a really compelling kind of like job opportunity to go and build a growth team from the ground up on a mechanism that was already established, that had, strong retention there, but just hadn't built a muscle around user acquisition. And so it was later stage than I thought I would go. But like the whole function would be starting fresh. And so I went through and got to meet some of the executives there, and it just, it felt like they were committed to it, and kind of, just made sense. And so it was also a new muscle for me to develop, frankly. Like they took a bet on me. I think Stitch Fix did not have the same, our product there was like a styling algorithm. So like the user facing product was actually fairly limited. We had a website. We built different mobile tools over time where you could interact with your stylist and stuff like that, or interact with our catalog, sorry, not your stylist. But it was a very different set of like growth challenges that I actually found would be kind of round out my skill set from more of the product and community side of things over to performance marketing. So yeah, that's kind of the backstory of how I ended up there. I could talk a little bit about what growth meant there and how we went about it, but maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, I would actually, I'd love to jump into that a little bit more and talk about, what was growth like when you joined, and, how did that kind of evolve over the course of time, throughout up to the IPO and maybe after?
Yeah, well, the when I mentioned it had like a really good foundation, it was because like the entirety of the business at that time was focused on retention and like predictability. Like remember, we were holding inventory and we also wanted to be profitable. And so getting like our buy quantities right and also figuring out like how do we retain our clients in some predictable cadence was like the name of the game. And so we had built this really strong demand forecasting and like data science team very early days. Like if you look at Katrina in her first like 10 hires were, the former COO of Walmart.com, Mike Smith, Julie, who she brought into the board, who I mentioned, who was the CMO at Sephora before that, and then Eric Colson, who was the head of data science at Netflix. And so like all those all those people joined and they really set like the DNA for what the company would become. So yeah, we had the retention thing down in a way that I hadn't seen most companies, at that stage. So when I joined, like the ask was basically help us build a muscle around user acquisition because we think we might want to go public over the next couple of years, and like you need predictability on this. It's like unacceptable and to have it outsourced or just beyond your control. And so at that time we had started working with a couple of agencies, like it basically while they were looking to fill the seat. And it was I'll spare the details, but we decided that like it was this like fully outsourced model where like this agency owned our ad accounts. We didn't really have control over them, and it was just not the agreement that we wanted to kind of keep going down. So basically we had a fresh start, like new Facebook accounts, new Google accounts, basically just like literally starting everything from scratch. And at that time it was just me. I started hiring like very, very quickly. And we structured the team basically by, we had directors or managers that were overseeing like channels or groups of channels. And then we paired them with some like technical counterparts, either data science or PM or Eng, like when we started to hit scale. But it was really like, I think many people probably have seen like how performance marketing functions are built out, and there's nothing, a lot of those basics we got right. I would say, I started buying Facebook ads in 2011, 2012. And so in those days, like, you could actually find some arbitrage by being like a really savvy media buyer. I think nowadays it's around like having great creative and great data pipelines, and like, rushing into new channels of your early stage and, just getting to them before saturation. But with Facebook and Google, essentially, a lot of the magic that we had there was on like using that data science DNA to build better like measurement sophistication. And so we didn't have, rather than relying on like simplistic attribution models, we were doing like incrementality testing across everything, which is probably a separate conversation if anyone's interested. And then on creative, we had this big in-house creative team that was doing photo shoots like for a stylist portal, and we actually started to get into a better routine on just like optimizing and increasing the cadence of actually getting creative out there. We also, I would say the big thing that we did at the time that gave us some advantage to our competitors is we invested pretty heavily in offline channels. And so we felt like we had built this strong sophistication around like digital marketing, which is kind of table stakes. But in the offline world, like at that time, people buying TV, radio, et cetera, like it was, or podcasts, we were fairly early to that. They were just approaching it as like brand marketing and without like a ton of sophistication. And so that like, we treated those as performance channels. And I think, again, I think that ended up being, I guess, a differentiated part of our mix and what we were doing. But yeah, it was a good set of lessons there. I think now as an investor, you could see it's a lot easier to kind of understand like where the gotchas are when you're looking at some of this stuff. Like I think one of the things that we did, and I'll pause after this point, but like probably the most impactful thing that we did during my time was actually, I was in charge of user acquisition, but that could be gained quite easily if we're going our team on like signups. And so we actually we shifted our entire objective function to to more of a down funnel metric on like retention. And so going our acquisition efforts on retention was like a very big game changer for us. Maybe it sounds like trivial, or maybe it sounds simple, but when you're spending at that scale, like shifting your objective function and what you're kind of optimizing all your channels to some like downstream retention metric was quite impactful for us. So
awesome. And thanks for sharing more on that. So that was it's quite the journey. So what was the growth team like at the point when you left?
We had probably 20, 25 people. It was organized roughly by like channel groupings there. And so we had like, we had what we would call digital, which was basically like Facebook, programmatic display, YouTube, starting to invest heavily in. I think Snap was running out of there at that point. Then we had a team that was focused on search, so SEM and SEO, which is kind of a different, I find that marketers, and even though that still is digital, like it's kind of a different skill set. People are really deep on SEM. We had a team around offline. So that was TV, radio, direct mail, podcast. We had one that was on kind of like foundational, like infrastructure, so like marketing tech, which was a huge area of investment. There's a guy from Wish who, if you know about them, like they're basically an advertising business. So was in charge of that. I think broadening out, there were more efforts around like referral and like landing pages and that type of thing. But really, like those were the core. We bucketed by like core channel groupings. Our mobile app, which was kind of it sounds like, again, something that we just hadn't really paid a lot of attention to until like fairly late in the game, just because Stitch Fix, again, is not really like a recurring like usage. It's more of a passive like subscription service for most people. So yeah, that's what it looked like. Again, it's quite different than other companies I spend time with, like in marketplaces and such, where the growth team ends up being like these pods of PMs, data scientists, eng, design, all grouped together working on like some shared metric, versus at Stitch Fix, like, yes, we were doing user acquisition or a little bit more down funnel, but the reality is it was a performance marketing group at that stage. So
awesome. Yeah, I definitely wanted to jump into more of on the marketplaces side too. And since you have advised quite a few marketplaces following that, I wanted to jump into maybe what your experience is, advising them on growth, and maybe some some kind of like consistent themes you've seen across them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big topic, and I'm happy to, if there's specific questions, I'm happy to go in a little bit more. I mean, I've made a few investments in B2B marketplaces at Greylock, and then I'm familiar. We have other consumer marketplaces in our portfolio, and I'm close to them and stuff. So I think there are some commonalities across them. But I will say, like with B2B, it ends up being at the stage we invest. Some of these are seed, some are Series A. Like it tends to be a fairly different set of challenges. But I do think like now it's the lens I look at them through now is like understanding basically like, topics like how do you measure liquidity in marketplaces? What are the, growth loops? A bunch of like the questions that I think, have already been like widely covered by investors who like invest in marketplaces. But that's different than actually when you're inside of one of these things. Like, what do you, how do you actually architect growth? And actually, one of the smartest people on this topic I would point to is Gustav, who's a friend who's over at Airbnb. We would get our teams together back when he was at Airbnb. Now he's at YC, but when I was at Tilt and he was at Airbnb. And I think what was always interesting to me, they basically deployed all the teams that were working on growth there were like product teams first. And so I remember, if anyone's focused on like referrals here, like they have some of the best content out there. I remember going to one of their meetups where Ivan Kirigan, who was he launched like Dropbox's referral program. He did the talk like with Gustav, and like they shared like such a, I mean, that basically both our referral programs at Tilt and then at Stitch Fix like were heavily influenced by the stuff they talked about. But like they continue to squeeze, that was an amplifier on everything else that they did on growth. And so I was always like struck by how they built a team around that, but it wasn't just like a project. It was like a ongoing team focused on like this one kind of component of growth that just ended up being an accelerant to everything else they did. And so again, I've talked about the topic of referrals. I tend to think most companies have more juice to squeeze there than they realize. But what was interesting is as I got to know Airbnb better, like they were also doing, I mean, booking has like the amount they spent on marketing is insane. And so Airbnb was kind of playing in that same zone. And like the teams around that were product teams first. It wasn't marketers as much as it was like PMs and engineers actually working to deploy like ad spend like programmatically at scale. And so I always felt like that was quite interesting. In their marketing tech group, there was a guy, Dimitri, there that was really smart on this stuff. But yeah, but so those are a little bit more tactical. I think taking a step up, I mean, the stuff I would harp on is like the importance of actually understanding and developing your growth model like earlier on. I think I've talked about this before. Lenny Rachitsky was also at Airbnb, and then Dan Hockenmeyer, who's a buddy who helps companies on this stuff. He was at Thumbtack. They built like Dan has built like a practice around this stuff, and that's like it's again at a certain, if you're too early, sometimes it can be like almost a frustrating exercise to do. But I do think like having a sense of how the different levers in your business, like how to prioritize them and also like where the synergies are, I think is one of the most important things one could do early on to make sure you're like marching in the right direction. And so, I think a lot of you could tell when a company has some sense of that versus like when they don't. But ultimately, I guess the last thing I would say is usually as an investor, the most important thing I look for in these businesses are like, what's going on with the cohorts and how are they trending? And it's not like it needs to be some absolute number. But what ideally what you want to see is like some group of people, both on the supply and the demand side, who are intensely engaged. And I think like that's a strong predictor of almost everything else. And it's okay, but if it's not the right fit for a bunch of people early on, like over time, with liquidity, you would expect that to improve. But there should be some people who are like actually hacking, who find like this marketplace so potentially groundbreaking to them that they're willing to like, overcome product challenges or lack of liquidity in certain areas or whatever, just to make it work for them. And that generally shows up in the cohort metrics. And I early on, I look for that signal for sure. And sometimes you actually need to like get on calls with users to like understand that. But that's yeah, a few scattered thoughts, but I'll stop there.
I think that's a great point. As far as, a lot of early stage marketplace founders try to skip over that sometimes, since it is a little bit frustrating. So I did want to bring up this, you kind of brought it up though, a point about, your unique experience on the actual operator side, working within these marketplaces, and then, now investing at, how, or maybe looking back, like what are some kind of learnings that have equipped you now on the investment side?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think it's always like I think it's Greylock tends to hire like ex operators or company builders, and so we have a bias on this point, but I think it can be very hard. There's a lot of, I mean, marketplaces are like really intricate and complex businesses, so it's very intellectually stimulating and tempting to like wax poetic on these things and sound very smart. And a lot of people actually are very smart on them. People I respect who have not been in the company building seat, who are some of the smartest people on marketplaces out there, like Bill Gurley, for instance, who's influenced my thinking on this stuff heavily. I would say still are having been in the seat before, you understand like how manual and messy this stuff could be early on, and how much like, sometimes you just need to like embrace the fact that it's a grind, and getting to liquidity early could be, a highly manual effort. Lenny's written a lot about this too, but I think like, the cliche like Paul Graham quote, like do things that don't scale. It's easier for an investor to come and say that, but I think having been in the seat and having like knowing what it takes to actually go and do that, I think just makes it a little bit easier to like empathize with what entrepreneurs are going through there. I think and there's, to some extent, like there's no substitute for that. Like I think and it's interesting now, like I've there's founders I work with who have taken, Reforge, who understand like the theory behind all of this stuff, and probably end up being like I would say overly focused on that too early, of what like the perfect growth model looks like. And and really, you're almost like skipping a step if you get to that before you've like really just been in the trenches with your users on both sides. And so that's probably the thing that sticks with me most, is just like the importance of doing that, and actually like loving doing that too. So there's a bunch of like, you guys have seen probably all the same checklists on like what attributes people look for, and how to measure liquidity, how do you bootstrap like supply side versus demand side first, all the terminology that like marketplace people like talk about. This stuff's all important, but really like sometimes it's actually really helpful to take a step back from that and realize that as a founder of one of these things, like your job is actually to have the deepest level of empathy for people who are on both sides of it early on, and just like get to know them. And I find that that's probably advice that's a little bit easier to give if you've been there before. So
No, that's definitely great advice. So I won't take up the whole chat, just you and I discussing topics. But we have some questions right here, if that sounds good, if we can jump into a few.
Cool.
Let's see, Faraj, did you want to come on?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks, Mike. Well, one of the questions that I had is, even when like you start to have a good understanding of like liquidity within your marketplace, we have a marketplace that connects like cannabis contractors with work opportunities at farms and dispensaries. How do you kind of draw, as an investor, tangential relationship to the monetization potential of that marketplace? Because I think like that's something that I've been trying to wrap my head around. Like the pricing model changes every day, but like really though, like what does that liquidity mean in terms of your end result? Would love to hear some of your thoughts around that.
Yeah, well, and especially with B2B marketplaces, which it sounds like yours is, monetization is a interesting topic. It's a little bit less straightforward than on consumer, where typically it's like just a rake, right? A GMV take. And in some B2B marketplaces, it is like, if you look at Fair as being maybe the largest example right now of a B2B marketplace that's kind of in the in kind of the ecosystem. I think they do have a flat take. They also have like a pretty big financial services like component as well. So I think honestly with B2B, I think we're going to see more innovation on like the monetization front. And it's something that I talk to the founders I work with on like what that looks like. There is a menu of options that's like starting to emerge. And I think, by the way, part of the like B2B marketplaces are not new. Like they've been tried over the years, and typically they've been unsuccessful. But I do think like there's, when we talk about the why now and why we think like this attempt is going to be different, at least why I'm betting some of my career behind this point, it's I think demand now is more global than it's ever been. Consumer expectations are very different. We all shop on like Amazon and such, and then those same people are doing procurement in their B2B jobs, and so just have a different expectation level than before. The old school nature of like buying through trade shows, sales reps, et cetera, is just like changing. And digitizing this stuff is like, there's more software to do that now than ever. But I think the other big thing is like the fintech, embedded fintech opportunity is like very real, and like there's like a different menu of monetization streams now that than there were, even 5 years ago. So I wish I had a straightforward answer for you. I'd have to get to know your business better. I think like I've seen more and more businesses talk about factoring, about having some like deeper like workflow SaaS where you end up charging SaaS as well. Some of them actually charge flat fees per order, which kind of equates to a GMV take. I mean, some of them are the markets are so massive, we're actually charging a very small rate on GMV. There's not a lot of like pushback on that. These can become very big businesses very quickly. Not like a Fair, I think, is charging like 20%. Like you don't have to get anyone close to that. Some of these are charging 1 to 2, and that's pretty compelling. So yeah, I would say like as an investor, like the cleanest models are ones where you actually can charge take, but I think but it's increasingly common on B2B for that not to be the model. And yeah, I'm sorry, I wish I had a cleaner answer, but it's kind of like I'm seeing a lot going on there. So
That's great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Awesome. That's a good question. I had to bring on a B2B marketplace founder. So
Yeah.
Cool. Hey, Pablo, did you want to come on?
Sure, thank you. Another B2B marketplace. Thanks, Mike, for sharing your story. So we're a B2B marketplace. We're focusing on the talent economy, specifically software developers. We have a very successful, profitable marketplace. But I think that to the eyes of VCs, it's probably either too small, or because of the dynamics of the typically marketplaces, you have winner takes all or winner takes most, and we are just one of probably thousands of marketplaces doing something similar. We've kind of sat down and we're reassessing our strategy in terms of becoming attractive to VCs. And one of the things that we've been looking at is the framework of NFX. I don't know if you're familiar with it, with the market networks.
Yep.
Because we have a successful marketplace, we are seeing some network effects. And then the third component of that framework is the SaaS tool. So we're thinking about, should we build, and the question really was going to be, is that a good place for us to be in terms of like thinking along the lines of that framework? Or because you just mentioned the whole thing about growth loops at the end of your chat, are we maybe not? Should we maybe focus on making those growth loops better on the demand and supply side before even thinking about going to the SaaS?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
well. I'd like to dig in a little bit, if it's okay, and understand a little bit more about the business and what you're doing, because I do. One of the things you said that kind of stuck with me is like changing the model for investors, and I think that's in general is probably like the wrong reason to. I understand maybe you're dependent. It sounds like you're profitable, so maybe you're not dependent on like funding to keep the business going. But I think most investors will not understand the extent of what you're trying to do anywhere close to how much you will. So that's like just one of the things I would say. But I think I guess on this, the question I would have for you is like, if you play out these different scenarios, like where is the ceiling for each one? Because I actually think it's, again, I don't know what market you're in, but the like, it's too small. Many people, like myself included, I actually could view it as a flag if someone's going after something that's like too big, too early. And really it's about like, can you actually build liquidity and like, some network effects like within one clearly defined, like small enough, like vertical. And then that's piece one. Piece two is actually what happens as things start to expand from there. So I don't know if small market would be a reason I would dismiss something. But yeah, maybe you could give a little bit more color on that point, so I could give you a better answer on the SaaS side.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. I appreciate it. So the reason why we're seeing, I think, as a small market is because we're niche. So if you think about the developer ecosystem, we're operating on three technologies within the JavaScript world. So we're just saying, we're very small in the programming world, and even when we picked one technology, we're even only working on 3 of those, I don't know, 20 or plus potential ones. So yes, I agree that we could slowly go and grow into the rest of that ecosystem and then start eating up market share from others that exist, like I don't know, the big ones, TopTal, who knows, Fiverr or whatever else is large. So yeah, I mean, we could go that way and show larger growth. And then of course we have the temptation to go on a different side where we still don't know what the SaaS would be, right? We just know that there are tools that developers use, and then we're still in the brainstorming stage of like, what is, what could be a good tool for, for us to tack into our business model, because that could be more attractive to VCs, because now we have marketplace revenue, which is pretty good, but it's transactional. But we also have the SaaS recurring revenue. That's kind of the logic behind it.
Got it. Okay, that helps. Yeah, and I do think like these, I've spent time with some related bot models, and I think like maybe one framing of it is or one kind of thought exercise is like what model will deliver the best like end customer results, and like does it need to be a marketplace, which is kind of where you're getting at with like the market network thing, because I think you could argue that actually looking more of like a tech-enabled like agency at the start could end up being like better for both sides. Again, I'm speaking without a lot of context here, but I do know, if you look at what supply ultimately wants is probably, they're going to go to where they can make the most money and have, probably right flexibility and just like probably high percentage of time being monetized. And then on the demand side, they probably want the fastest turnaround and most predictable and high quality like kind of end result. And so sometimes actually going like full open marketplace too early could actually work against that, even if it's in the vision long term. So I think like the models here that I think are most intriguing to me are ones where software is actually like creates stickiness on both sides, i.e. like talent would not be as successful if it weren't for like the core product and software you're building. So it gets beyond just like the match of supply and demand. And also on the demand side, maybe there's something on like the end delivery or I'm thinking through a lens of some like, I guess like creative marketplaces where having all of your assets kind of live in one place and you kind of have your portal to go and work with different supply on them, just kind of has some like lock-in and stickiness. So I would think about like the role of software there, and less like what can I charge for like the SaaS, and more is there real tech here that could drive better lock-in on both sides. So, and I guess that, and I think by the way, James Curry and the NFX team are very, very smart on this stuff, and we, they're friends of Greylock too, and so I while I don't know the term market network or managed marketplaces are always used like consistently, I think it's an interesting like thread to go down. So maybe I don't want to eat up all the time on this, but I do think that at least is one thing that I look for when I hear of situations like this, if that helps. So
I appreciate it. Thank you for the insight. Yeah.
Sure.
Thanks, Mike.
Awesome. No, that's super helpful. Thanks, Mike, for that. So there's quite a few in the group that I think will definitely benefit from that. And they're kind of in the same place, their marketplaces. Cool. So we're going to jump into Rich wanted to come on. So he had I think he listened to your podcast for the On Demand with Max. So.
Oh yeah, on deck.
Hey Mike, founder of Bamboo, which is a Instacart for wholesale food supplies. Was curious to know if I was reading about Convoy earlier, and they go very heavy in their website talking about the climate change impact, so how much emissions they're reducing. Do you think in the future marketplaces will start to get tax credits for kind of highlighting how much climate change they're avoiding?
Ooh, I hope so. I honestly, it's not a topic I've spent much time on. I think I do know, I guess all I could state is the obvious here, that that this is perhaps the biggest problem facing our generation, and a lot of investors are really starting to pay attention to it. And so I think, and I'm seeing a lot of stuff kind of in the climate and impact world get funded, which I think is a great thing. I don't know, unfortunately, I don't really I've not spent enough time thinking about this to know how it would be taxed, and what are the credits that marketplaces should get. But I think the angle I would think about it from is like, I think it's a consumers are becoming more conscious of this and actually will express a preference to buying in places where their impact can be reduced, and just buying from conscious like brands, and suppliers overall. And so I think, I've actually seen some services. There's one recently there where a consumer could actually like toggle something at checkout on an e-commerce site and actually give an extra 50 cents or whatever to kind of offset the carbon impact. And like the uptake on that was interesting. I would think that the majority of consumers wouldn't care. And it gives me some optimism to know that a good chunk of them do. So yeah, it's a really great question. It's not impacting the marketplaces that I've spent time with yet, but you've actually convinced me to go and probably talk to them about it. So thank you.
No, yeah, I was pitching to a VC recently, and they asked me if we were calculating specifically how much we were saving, because they alluded to the fact that it could come our way. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it's a really good push. Honestly, I don't know, and I think it's a good question. So
cool. All right, thanks, Mike.
Awesome. Well, we have time for one more question, and we have a fan of your the headless commerce. So let's. Hey, Levi, do you want to come on?
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. Really appreciated that conversation you had on Gray Matter. And I think one of the things that I wanted to talk about was really, I think, how influential your time at Tilt was, right? Because given the three areas that you guys attack, the surface areas, right, with group payments, like Commerce API, and really like the whole infrastructure needs and how that's just continued to really, I think, develop and grow, as well as like the feed itself, right, where I look at sort of players like SnackPass and how there's still just a lot of room to innovate there, and how that has sort of influenced, like that time that has influenced a lot of the investments that you've done, over the last, say, couple of years. So would love to pull on those threads there.
Yeah, well, thanks for acknowledging that. Most people don't go that deep, and you're right. Like I think Tilt, one of our critical errors was actually trying to build like 3 concurrent businesses at once. I think at a certain point of scale, we would have earned ourselves the right to do that. But we had like one of our strongest teams in the company was building this, as you noted, like Commerce API, where you could actually build pre-orders into your own site. And that was on the same kind of stack as our core consumer feed. And so like you would, if you were a brand, like we built pre-orders, brands who would have graduated from Kickstarter that wanted to continue to like collect orders on their own site, kind of own the customer experience, own their customer list. We were doing stuff like at the time, I think, for boosted boards and June of, like brands you would know now. There was this was before a lot of people were paying attention to Shopify as well, and so it was kind of competitive, like with what they were doing. But I think what was less important, honestly, was like having those brands participate in our consumer feed. I mean, it sounded nice to be able to drive them distribution, but the reality is like most of these brands were driving their own distribution, just like Shopify is not a marketplace. I think we made the error of actually, expecting that they needed to be integrated for the B2B side to be successful. And that actually probably led to just like, a bunch of overhead and confusion and kind of unnecessary complexity internally. So you take something like Shopify, and now I end up investing in things that are like growing on their rails and just ecosystem plays, and also things that exist outside of Shopify and all that. Like, I think very comfortable. And it's interesting, like Shopify is sitting, if they wanted to become a marketplace, like they're sitting on a massive near-term like revenue opportunity, but there's a question of whether that's the right long-term play for them. And I think they've shown a lot of restraint there. So yeah, I respect the desire to like, or the move to kind of like stay SaaS right now, but still find ways to leverage cross merchant data, which they're doing. If you saw like Shop Pay, they made an announcement today, like that's now following, you could use Shop Pay on like Facebook and Instagram checkout. And so that's a product that obviously is going to, it's one way of like their network effect, like manifesting without them being a marketplace and kind of helping push some merchants over others. So yeah, I mean, I guess all that stuff, maybe if I was conscious of it or not, the foundation was kind of laid at Tilt. The other angle too is like social commerce, which has kind of been a buzzword for some time now, but like that's what we were doing there. We were, this Venmo like feed where, people and money were interacting, but then you would have brands like launching t-shirts and products into that feed as well. And so like, I think what many people, at least our thesis back at Tilt, was there were plenty of social platforms that try to layer on commerce and failed, but we thought the winning play would actually be commerce first and layer on social later, because commerce was like the harder stuff to get right. And I guess it's to be seen, like what will happen here. Like there's a lot of stuff going on now with live, Facebook, it seems like their attempts now are more real than ever. It's not the first time they tried to like do social commerce. And yeah, this notion of like, embedded checkouts, commerce everywhere. I think I'm more bullish on that now than I've ever been. But it's not, I guess I've been through, I have my battle scars on that front, right? And so I would say I'm cautiously optimistic and all that stuff, and I am investing behind it. So,
cool. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, would love to, sometimes just dive a little deeper on social commerce and some of that stuff. But yeah, thanks for carving out time for us today.
Yeah, of course. Are you working on something in that zone? Or?
Yeah, our thesis is that social is the new storefront, and who has the most attention when it comes to social is creators. And so really just building in piping that makes creators a storefront, right? So if a user or a customer is discovering Everlane or Allbridge from a creator, then why not just have the tools that allow them to purchase directly from there? So that's really our thesis there.
Yeah, cool. Well, shoot me a note after. I'm happy to talk about it sometime.
Sounds good, Mike.
Awesome. Great question, Levi. So cool. So we're almost out of time, Mike, but this is a really great chat so thanks again for this. So what, I did have a question for you, and to kind of wrap things up, what's maybe one memorable moment that you're kind of prideful about that kind of stands out for you?
Ooh, interesting. I don't know. I don't like to like boast on this stuff. So I feel like it would be like, ultimately, this may be a cop-out answer, but like the most, honestly, the thing I miss most about this job in venture is like not being able to hire. I mean, I've hired one person, these firms hire people like very slowly. And ultimately, like it is, the founders I work with are kind of, you get like the personal and coaching and like professional development and stuff, like satisfaction out of that, but it's a little bit different. The moments for me were always like when people I hired like took that next step up, or you see them, like you take a bet on someone that's unproven and it ends up working out. And those are the times where like clearly I saw something and someone gave them the chance and just got out of the way. And usually like all the people that I was grateful, like I mentioned back at Stitch Fix, and I was hired, I didn't really know what I was doing on this front. Like, I guess Julie, who hired me, like saw the potential that I could figure it out. And thankfully I did, but really it was around like being able to hire people that were much smarter than me at their own domains. Like the person I hired to run Facebook ads there, she had been living in that world for, a number of years and was on the ad tech side and ended up being one of the strongest hires, like, in the company during my time there, and just taught me most of what I know about that channel. And that's, I think, the way it should go. Like if you hire people that are much smarter than yourself, who are much deeper into it, there's no other way to hire in a startup, in my opinion. Otherwise, you're just not going to get leverage because you look for people that could grow faster than the pace of the company. And unfortunately, that means people who aren't. It's like you have to make hard decisions on those people oftentimes, and that usually ends up being right for everyone's like equity long term as well. But I think the moments I guess I would say I'm most proud of were like, you take a bet on someone who's unproven, you nurture them a little bit, and they end up teaching you a lot, but they end up being more successful than you would have imagined. And that would be my answer on that. So
no, I love it. I think that's a great way to kind of wrap things up, and for us all as marketplace founders that are building teams ourselves. So, well, this is a really great chat, Mike. So thanks again for joining us. Last kind of last thing, time for kind of quick plug. Where can we keep up with you at?
Oh yeah, well, I'm in the group. Just DM me on Twitter. I'm Duboe there, and Mike at Greylock as well. Email. So yeah, hit me up. And it's a pleasure to chat with you all. I don't know a ton about what you're all building, but I think this stuff is really fun to geek out on, and I have a lot of respect. Marketplaces are not easy to spin up, especially in the early days. So I have a lot of respect and admiration of people who are going down this path. So here's a resource.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. So this is a real treat to have you join us here today. So thanks for that. And thanks everyone for joining in and the great questions.